Welcome to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vinoski. Industry has a million cool stories, and Jim talks to the movers and shakers who are making them happen. Let's dive in.
Welcome back to Manufacturing Talks. I'm Jim Vinoski, your host. We are sponsored by Cosgrove Content, wordsmiths for industry. So if you struggle to find people who can write about your technical things that you do, manufacturing and industry, that's what we're all about. See us at cosgrovecontent.com. And I am really happy to be joined by a guy I've known for a while, Mark O'Brien. He's founder and principal of O'Brien Communication Group, which will celebrate its 19th birthday on March 1st. That is a B2B brand management and marketing company. Mark is also a writer of some renown, in my opinion, and that's what brings him here today. We'll talk about that. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to try to live up to that introduction.
You will have no trouble. This is really cool. Mark and I have traded thoughts on a great many things over, I don't even know how many years, several at least.
Several.
Which has been great fun. And now I was reading one of his pieces just the other day, and I told him before we got on here, it immediately hit me that that's got to be not only on the show, but our very next show, because I think it's so important. It was an article called Give It a Shot, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So before we do that, though, Mark, just tell us a little bit about your background, what you got into, what got you into what you do, and what your life is all about.
Sometimes I see a meme or a diagram of something that shows, plan A, straight line, and then reality all over the place. So referring to my backdrop, I spent 10 years after high school thinking I was going to be a rock star, which is why I'm sitting here today. And then at 28, I decided I wasn't getting any younger, and I most certainly was not getting any smarter. So I decided I probably better get to school. So 28, I went to school. To compress, came out of school, spent about 12 years working at 3 different insurance companies. Got out of there, went to work at a small public relations agency, transitioned from there to a larger advertising and public relations agency. Watched the people that I worked for at those 2 agencies, whom I love dearly, I don't want to be misunderstood about that, do so many things wrong in terms of what I thought was important, which was establishing long-term trusting relationships. So March 1st, 2004, I decided, you know what, I got to give this a shot. And just as a little bit of a backstory, my birthday is January 30th. I gave my notice at the ad agency on my 50th birthday.
Oh, wow.
I walked in 8 o'clock in the morning with my letter. My boss looked up. He saw me with the letter in my hand. He knew what I was going to do. He got up, closed the door, and spent 2.5 hours talking to me about how and why I was going to fail.
Oh, nice.
You're never going to be able to do this. You'll never be able to retire. This is a young man's business, on and on and on. I just sat and listened. I think I had a cup of coffee. But at the end of the tirade, I just thanked him very much, shook his hand, and the rest, as they say.
Well, and so that's so in keeping with what we're here to discuss today. And, the gist of the article, just to kind of boil it down, is how nothing happens if you're not willing to start, right?
Yeah, man. And one of the things that I've come to firmly believe is, presuming you believe in a God anyway, there's a plan. There is most definitely a plan. But it took me a really long time to figure out that my job was not to figure out the plan. My job was to stay awake and to read the signs that were put on my path and make the most responsible decisions I could when I got to those signs. So I'll just give you one example. It's January 30th, 2004. I've just given my notice. I'm driving home from work. I'm scared to death. My phone rings. It's my older sister. She's calling for two reasons. One, to wish me happy birthday. Two, to tell me that her husband, a retired naval officer now working for a military contracting consultancy, has just been diagnosed with prostate cancer.
Okay.
Now, knowing my brother-in-law as I do, I knew exactly what he was going to do. He was going to research the disease. He was going to research his treatment options. He was going to pick one and he was going to beat it. So I got home that night and I'm thinking, really? You just quit your job to start a new business and you're scared? This guy's looking down the barrel of cancer and all he's going to do is get on with it. And that was precisely the sign I needed. Just do it.
Yeah. Was that your first kind of encounter with that? Had you had earlier kind of signs on that whole notion of, you got to start, you got to do it for yourself?
One, and it was enormous. And I consider myself fortunate and blessed that I even got it. When I first decided to go to school, I took 2 classes part-time. There was an introduction to management class on Monday nights. And I knew on day one, that just wasn't for me.
Yeah.
And the second one on Thursday nights was introduction to literature. So toward the end of the semester, the professor said to me, look, next semester, spring semester, I'm offering an honors seminar and you really need to be in that. So, at that point, I'm the happy idiot and I go, yeah, okay. He said, no. I don't think you understand what I'm telling you. And I said, oh, okay, well, what are you telling me? And he said, it meets 3 days a week in the afternoon. And I thought, oh, so that was the first time I read the tea leaves. And I quit my job. I moved from my hometown, went to Hartford, became a full-time student, and everything thereafter followed. And that's where I learned the lesson. That was the first big sign.
Yeah. So let's talk about the article itself. What prompted you to write it?
Kids.
Ah, yeah.
So I'll just go into this backstory a little bit. I don't remember what year it was, maybe 2007, something like that. I needed a new computer. And there was a young guy who was working for me at the time. And he said, look, when you get your computer, whatever you do, buy an external floppy drive. And I said, what would I do that for? And he said, because they're cheap as hell and you can't be too safe. So I said, okay. So I did. And sometime after that, I found out about a company that's now become Kindle Direct Publishing called CreateSpace. And you could publish your own books. So I remembered that one time I had just written this line, Stephen A. Kindle had only one wish. And what occurred to me about that line is that it seemed rhythmic enough that it might be poetic and maybe it might turn into a book sometime. So one Saturday morning, I got out my portable floppy drive and plugged it in, pulled out my old box of discs and started plugging them in until I found that file. So I followed it through and I wrote my first book for children called Martin the Marlin. And I had no idea this was going to happen, but when I created a Martin the Marlin Facebook page, I started to get opportunities to go to schools to talk to children. And, I have 2 adult sons, but what going to school with all those younger people taught me was that kids are fearless. They don't worry about all the stuff that we do. Maybe it's because they don't think about realistic consequences, but I don't think so. I think it's because they haven't yet been done out of their sources or their senses, I should say, of wonder and adventure. So they just do it. And so what I learned was that once we get beyond a certain age, depending on our environments and our conditioning, we somehow come about the notion that if we're going to do something, our first step needs to be perfect, which is as impossible as it is ridiculous.
Well said.
Because there can't be a second or third step until you take the first one.
Yeah.
And if you take the first one and stop and look around, and if it's not what you expected, then change course or change the plan. And that's how you get to the second one. And if it's perfect, you take the second and then assess before you take the third. But it's the only way to get anywhere. And, you know, obviously I had started my business before then, but once I started getting greater exposure to children and recognized their fearlessness, I kind of saw what I had done earlier as luck, and then became much more deliberate about that. And I know it sounds ridiculous and I know it sounds simple, but that's really all it takes. And I grant you that there are some situations in which it takes some guts to do it. But I have to tell you that I don't consider myself to be a particularly courageous person. Sometimes you just get to the point at which the pain of staying put outweighs the fear of change. So you make the change.
Yeah. There's so much in society today that militates against that, though. You know, as you were talking about that nonsensical requirement that your first step be perfect, I was thinking about all this stuff online that says you've got to have your whole life mapped out. You know, you're coming out of college and you're supposed to know your whole life, you know, everything you're going to do, your life plan, and execute against it. And I'm thinking, man, when I was 22, I didn't know anything. I wouldn't have known my whole life if it had hit me upside the head. There's that. There's, you know, and you experienced it, the people who will not hesitate to tell you how you're going to fail if you do something different, which is also insane.
It is insane. I wrote another piece. I don't know if I shared this with you or not, but it's called "It's About Time," and it's about my whole relationship with time and change. And one of the folks I mentioned in there is a kid who's not a kid any longer, but a kid named Kenny Carpenter. In third grade, Kenny Carpenter told me that he was going to be an engineer at NASA. That guy is still an engineer at NASA. And I kid you not, if you go on YouTube and you put in Ken Carpenter NASA, you'll see a bunch of clips from him talking about the Hubble telescope.
That is too cool.
Which he was instrumental in developing. I have no idea how he knew that. Yeah. And I have no idea how or why he never changed his mind. And I also have to wonder, if you see those videos, you'll see that he's clearly a happy person. But I also wonder what he missed, and if he ever wonders about that. You know, I had somebody say to me once, you do know, of course, that you don't have to try to do something with every idea you get. And I said, well, what the hell else am I going to do with them? So it's just trying.
Yeah.
And
well,
yeah, you're going to fail, but so what?
Right. Well, and you raise a good point. You know, Ken obviously got what he desired all those years ago as a kid, but that shuts off other possibilities. And the fact is, there's an infinity of possibilities. And so you're choosing several among an infinity. You're never going to experience anything but a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of everything you could.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's another thing I hear people talking about as well. You know, this is my path. If I do that, it's going to screw up this path. Well, no, you can do more than one thing, but there is a limit, right?
Yes. Well, Yes, in terms of time to get things done, yes. Um, you get to a point on occasion, I think, at which you start to recognize that maybe after all, your youthful days notwithstanding, maybe your time and energy really are finite. And that's kind of a sobering thing, but I think it also makes you more judicious about the things that you choose to spend your time and energy on. And I think you become better at that. The first time, and I know that we touched upon this a little bit earlier, but you had sent me some questions, some things we might talk about.
Yep.
Although we both recognize we may not need to get to them. So the first time that I had a chance to take Martin the Marlin, and there are now 3 other books for children and another one in the works. But the first time I had the opportunity to take Martin the Marlin to an elementary school, all I knew headed in there was that the librarian's name was Miss Potter. And not only does she have the perfect name to be a school librarian, but if you looked up either school librarian or Miss Potter, you would see her picture because she was just so perfect. So I walk in the office and I tell them who I am and I ask for Miss Potter, and she comes down and I said to her, so where are we going to be? She points across the hall and she said, over there. And I said, that looks like a gym. And she said, yeah, it is. I said, how many kids are going to be in there? And she said, 320. And I said, well, why? And she said, because we're K-8 plus preschool. So now I'm doing the math and I'm thinking, well, there's going to be kids in there from age 3 to age 14. Maybe kids through 4th or 5th grade are going to care about Martin the Marlin. But for the rest of the kids, what am I going to do? So the first thing I did was I had prepared a list of questions. So as we're walking across the hall, I pull this list out of my briefcase and I hand them to Miss Potter. And I said, look, if this thing bombs, just read me a few of these questions and we'll get out. But it occurred to me as we were walking across the hall that obviously I'd share the story and the younger kids would love it. But I would also get to talk to them and ask them questions about creative pursuits and whether they do and whether they have any trepidation about that. And the question that I wanted to warm up to was, are any of you afraid of writing? And that's when I first started to understand that kids were fearless. So they had given me a microphone so I could walk around the gym and talk to different people. And when I asked if anybody was afraid of writing, I couldn't believe how many hands went up. So I got to talk to them about that. So one young man said to me, I have a lot of ideas and I start a whole bunch of them and have them written out, but I haven't finished any of them. And then I kind of had this revelation. And I said, look, I want to share with you the most powerful word I know, and it only has 3 letters. And that word is yet. I said, what if you said to me, I haven't finished them yet? And how much more powerful is it than that? Or if somebody asks you something and you have to say, I don't know, what happens if you say, I don't know yet? It gives you the opportunity to find out. It gives you the opportunity to create a response. And I said to this young man, those stories are yours. You've written them. They don't belong to anybody else. They are yours to determine the finishes to. You just haven't done it yet. And then I realized how much more applicable that was beyond that school full of kids from 3 to 14.
Well, and it goes back to your point that, if you are a believer in a higher power and that higher power has a plan, it may just not be time yet.
Well, yes. And people said to me when I started my business at 50, don't you wish you had done this earlier? And I would say readily, no. Yep. If I had been able, sure, but I wasn't.
Right.
So that was my time to do that. And I just have to add this one note. Another beautifully unforeseen implication of introducing the idea yet is, after I go to those schools, I invariably get in the mail, like a 9 by 12 manila envelope full of handmade cards from the students. And
Yep.
well, maybe you would believe how many of them mention the word yet. And I always think, as I'm going into any school, if only one child feels better when I leave there than that child felt before I arrived, that's the win. That's what you can hope for. So when I get those cards, and they all have very positive notes, and so many of them talk about yet, then I think, wow, that was absolutely worth doing. And I'm sorry, I got to share one more thing.
Go ahead.
I always tell them, I don't know why, but they always invite me to schools in the morning. And I always say to the kids, I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy to start my day with all of you young, happy, smiling people, because after this, I have to go spend the rest of my day with a bunch of grouchy old people. And they love that.
I love that. I'm gonna share a personal thing, and it's interesting about this yet thing and this plan. So my whole show here is about manufacturing, and this is a bit of a tangent because you're not from a manufacturing world, and yet what I told you up front was what I realized in doing the show is these manufacturing stories have such value whether you're in manufacturing or not. And so what hit me with your story, Give It a Shot, is that has such value back here in manufacturing and in life in general, obviously. But you're a writer and I'm a writer. I've been a writer my whole life, but not formally. I didn't really become a writer, to me, really formally until 4 years ago when I started writing for Forbes. When I got out of high school, I had two directions I could go: English or engineering. And I did different kinds of research, but I'll be brutally honest and say the one that hit home hardest was I looked at what each path paid and chose the one that was more lucrative and went into engineering. Got into manufacturing, even though I had a counselor in college who said manufacturing was a dead end, don't do that, and that's not where you're going to have a career. And here I am, 35 years later with a very successful manufacturing career, and then doing writing along the way and occasionally getting things published here and there, but never any formula to it, never any oomph behind it. And one day, 4.5 years ago, I get on LinkedIn and there's a post there by a friend of mine who shared one from his friend saying, doing a favor for someone who needs a person who can write magazine-length articles about manufacturing.
Hello.
So I thought, well, that's interesting. Doesn't say what it's all about, but maybe it could be cool. So she'd given her email address. I sent her an email and I said, got 30 plus years in manufacturing. I've done quite a bit of writing. Would love to hear more. And within an hour, I got an email back and it said, I've looked your stuff up online. It looks great to me. I'm copying so-and-so at Forbes. You two take it from here. And my immediate thought was, okay, Forbes, well, that's not going to happen.
Oh, ye of little faith.
But, that one email where it was like, I could have just looked at that and thought, well, that's just going to be a waste of time.
Yep.
What's the point? And yet, 30 plus years of manufacturing gives me now this expertise to write for a very renowned publication that, like you say, when you started your business at 50, people say, why didn't you do it earlier? Because you couldn't. Right. And I couldn't have done this writing back when I started in industry or the first 10 or 20 years.
Yeah. Man, conditioning is just such a brutal thing. I think related to the whole idea of the, grand plan or whatever, I simply do not believe in accidents. There is nothing at all accidental. And it's just, it's a matter of whether we're going to follow through on the signs. When I worked at that small public relations agency in the late 90s, I love the woman who owned that agency dearly. And we were at lunch one day and we were having a conversation and she said to me, I think we're all victims of our own values. And I said, no, we're not. We're all victims of our own expectations. And I think our I don't know how to describe this, Jim, our environments, our circumstances, our upbringings, everything contributes to our expectations. So you could have had the expectation that nothing's going to come of that, so I'm not going to do it. But you didn't have that expectation. You didn't set yours unduly high, but they were high enough that you went after it. And it clearly turned out to be no accident whatsoever if you heard within an hour. I mean, that's just crazy. That's another sign. Wow.
Well, so let me share another very personal piece of that. I had somewhat fallen off the writing game a few years before that happened. And my younger sister was also a writer. She passed away a couple of years before that.
Sorry.
And at the time, thank you. If there's a silver lining though, at the time I thought, I've fallen off my writing. She was really the writer and she's gone. I should probably pick that up.
Wow. Wow.
And so the reason I had stuff out there for this woman to look up is because of that. And part of what I found out later is what the Forbes editors look for contributors is someone who's been already consistently writing.
Can you imagine someone trying to convince you all of that is accidental?
Right. Exactly. No.
Wow, that's amazing.
So now you're seeing a little more about why there was a bit of a gut punch to reading your marvelous piece. Give it a shot.
Very, very interesting. I'll throw this out. I won't belabor. I guess I'll call them the difficulties of my upbringing. I will say this: my dad was a Marine, and my dad was a guy for whom the rules were everything. Just show me the rules, I'm good. I think my father may have been the only person I know who A, enjoyed boot camp, and B, actually gained weight in boot camp. So I have this theory that, if you're the son of a guy like that, you have two fundamental choices. You either become that or you become the anti-that. And I ended up becoming the anti-that. And so needless to say, for the longest time, my dad just didn't get it. But I always knew I was a writer, and I always knew that could not be taken away from me. It took quite a while for me, to fully realize that, to the point at which it started bearing any, I guess I'll say, creative fruit. But I just knew it. It was this one thing that just never ever went away, and I knew it couldn't ever be taken.
Yeah.
And here we are, and I can remember saying to somebody, excuse me, wow, my 50s are the most creative, fulfilling, rewarding decade of my life. And then my 60s is proving that untrue. I wouldn't go back for a second. It's just, charmed life, I'll grant you that. Luck of the Irish, we could call it anything we want. But it's absolutely true.
Yeah. That piece you said about always knowing that you're a writer, that also ties in, because in your article, you mentioned how people say, well, how do you know anyone's going to like your writing? Well, you do it. You put it out there, right?
Yeah. And you know what, though? I think that's a matter of curiosity. And
Yeah.
what I mean by that is I want to know if it's any good. There's only one way to find out.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the 10 years that I spent playing music pretty much full time, like 5-6 nights a week, people would ask me, what would you do if you won the lotto? And I would always say exactly the same thing. I would buy enough studio time to record all the songs that are floating around in my head for the purpose of putting them in the market to find out if they're any good. And if they're not any good and nothing happens with them, I would quite contentedly just say, fine, next.
Yeah. Yeah.
And go on to whatever.
One of those other endless opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's the power of give it a shot, is that you don't ever know until you try, until you put it out there.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with a woman one evening. We had connected on LinkedIn, and she called me one evening, and you know, she's apparently a devotee of Simon Sinek, and you know, what's your why and all that stuff. And
And
I
know
don't
your
happen
take
to
on
be,
that.
but that's a whole other thing.
It could be a show to itself.
Yeah. And you know what, along similar lines, I will tell you that one of my favorite books, and I refer it to people frequently, is and it's by a psychotherapist, but it's called "If You Meet the Buddha on the Road, Kill Him."
Okay, I'm writing that down.
The notion being that if you're looking for someone or something outside of you, that's a fool's errand. It's not out there. It's in here, and if you don't know it, you have to find it. I'll come back to the conversation on the phone in a minute. But I happened there's a beautiful quintessential congregational church in a little southeastern Connecticut coastal town called Old Lyme. And I happened to be in there one time with the pastor, whose name was David Good. Try to make that up. And
does he know Miss Potter?
Nobody should. I'm going to make that introduction. Thank you. And you know, I'm a recovering Irish Catholic boy, right? Excuse me. So I walk in, I'm looking around, and I said to him, where's all the stuff? And he goes, what stuff? And I said, you know, all the statues and all the, you know, the religious stuff. And he goes like this, right here. He said, if you don't bring it, it ain't here. So that's what I take away from "If You Meet the Buddha on the Road, Kill Him." But this woman I was speaking with on the phone said to me, if you had to tell me your why in 5 words, what would you say? So I gave it 1 second thought. And because I'm a writer, I knew I could cheat and hyphenate. I said, I write to restore self-faith. And I let that sink in for a minute. And then I said to her, and I don't mean mine. I firmly believe I write, and you know, this became sort of an unintended theme of my children's books. I write to try to get people to believe in themselves. Because until we do that, we don't have any idea what we're capable of. And when we do that, we freak ourselves out at what we're doing.
Yep. And I'm there myself now. So again, probably another piece why your superb article hit home. So a couple things popped up that I jotted down, and you've touched on one of them. Is there's always going to be these people who want to hold us back, right? You had your former boss who told you how you were going to fail. I've had multiple people like that. For me personally, I love to prove them wrong, but I know other folks who I've talked to where those kind of people and that kind of feedback will actually stop them from trying. So what do you say, number one, to the people who hear that and want to quit? Number two, to the people who would give that kind of crappy feedback?
The first thing I have to say, Jim, is that just makes me so incredibly sad.
I know.
It really does.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that I was on a Zoom call yesterday. I won't say what it was. I won't elaborate about its nature, but two things made me want to respond, and I didn't, because it was just not the appropriate context. But one gentleman said, "I'm feeling anxious and apprehensive because I'm afraid that I'm going to say something wrong in this conversation." And I wanted to say to him, "You can't. That's the whole purpose of this conversation, to be vulnerable and to share and to trust people, to be non-judgmental. You can't say anything wrong." And then another woman said that she had written something, not another woman, a woman said she had written something, and she got a call from somebody who read what she had written. And this person went on for an hour trashing her about what she had written. And she talked about how completely distressed and despondent that she was about that. And she said, "So I went out for an angry 6-mile walk and got over it." And I wanted to say to her, yeah, but you made the choice to let that person get to you and acknowledge any kind of correctness in that person's opinion.
Yep.
And you know, I said in the context of this conversation, it will surprise absolutely no one on this call, I said, that I'm a Batman fan. And I asked for a show of hands about who had seen the 1989 Tim Burton, Michael Keaton Batman movie. Jack Nicholson plays the Joker. And almost everybody raised their hand. And I said, there's a beautiful scene when Nicholson as the Joker ends up in Jack Palance's office suite, whatever it is, penthouse. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And you know, Jack Palance is playing Boss Grissom, and Boss Grissom tells Nicholson he's going to kill him. And Nicholson's sitting there with a martini glass, and he said, "I've already been dead once. It was quite liberating." and there's something about that resonates for me, because trying and failing and picking up and moving on and doing something else that's successful is just liberating as hell.
Yeah.
And by doing that, you
and
learn,
educational.
yeah.
Yep.
Unless you consider that success to be a freak accident, which it's not.
Right.
You also learn you could do it again.
Right. Yep.
And it makes you more willing to keep trying. And I just, you know, on the subject of not wanting to be daunted, I have to share this story about my wife, Anne. One of the 20 million or so reasons that I love her is that she learned without letting me know that she had learned. That if you want to get an Irishman to do something, tell him he can't do it. Either he's not capable or he doesn't have permission. And you can be absolutely certain that Thick Nick is going to do it.
Yeah, so that explains my take on all that, because you wouldn't know it by my name, but I'm 50% Irish.
Well, there you go. And so that you understand that the converse of that is, if you want to make sure that something never, ever gets done, tell an Irishman he has to do it. No.
Yep.
But she saw right through me right away.
That's awesome. So the other thing I jotted down is, and I can share a personal story on this too, is sometimes we're our own worst enemy, not necessarily in not getting started, but there's also the not sticking to something long enough.
Oh, oh boy. Um, God bless my dad, but that's another lesson that I learned from him. He in this same seaside community, Old Lyme, he had been on the board of selectmen. There's only 3 members. I mean, try to imagine anyone any more conservative than a U.S. Marine. My dad was a Democrat.
Well, yeah.
I had that conversation with him. At any rate, one time he decided to run for first selectman. And first he asked me if I would be involved in his campaign, and I said yes. And then I realized that, the people in the Democratic Town Committee were highly suspicious of who this young whippersnapper was, young being relative. I was like 38 at the time.
Yeah.
39 maybe. So I said to my father, look, for your sake, I'm just going to bow out of this because, these guys are going to end up resenting me and maybe even you. So as a Democrat in this highly Republican community, he lost by 34 votes. And he seemed to be okay with that. And I was livid. And I don't think I wrote my father more than 2 letters in my life, but I wrote this one and I said, you just tolerated the one thing you taught me to disdain, which was a half a job. These guys let you down and you're okay with it. And I can't be. And if you ever decide to run again, I want to manage your campaign. And the realization of what happened occurred to me one day when I was driving over the Tappan Zee Bridge. And I'm like halfway across. And I'm thinking, if my father had been in charge of building this bridge, he would have gotten halfway across and he would have panicked. And he would have thought, holy shit, there's no way in the world I'm going to be able to finish this thing. And then he would have been stuck trying to figure out how he was going to backtrack and convince everybody how and why he couldn't do it. So I called him and I just reiterated to him that if he did it again, I wanted to manage his campaign. So in 95, he ran again. And I decided that if everybody in town met him, they'd vote for him. But I also realized everybody in town couldn't meet him. So I said to him, we're going to do a series of 5 newsletters. And at that point, the post office had what was called bulk mail, of course. Yeah, so for next to nothing, you could bulk mail everybody in town. So it came the point. The first thing I said to his committee was, we're going to raise at least $10,000. And they said, no, we can't. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, no election committee in this town has ever raised more than $3,000. And I said, that's why we're here. So we got to the point in the campaign where it was time to do the 5th newsletter, and we were $1,500 short, but there was still money coming in. So I said to my father, we got to do this. And he said, well, how are we going to do that? And I said, you're going to have to put up the money to do this newsletter because we're going to more than make it up from our fundraising efforts. And he said, no. I said, okay, you're telling the committee that. You're telling all of these people who have volunteered all their time for all this time that you're not going to do it. I'm just going to watch you do it. Next thing I know, he pulls out his checkbook, writes a check, we do the newsletter, and he won in a landslide. Unseated a 4-term incumbent, sorry. And if the guy had won his 5th term, his retirement from the town would have provided his health benefits for the rest of his life. And we beat that guy because we stuck to it. But that's what I learned from my dad. If you don't stick to it, you don't have any right to think you're going to succeed.
So there's another lesson there too, is if you have those doubts or you're tempted to give in, surround yourself with people who will carry you along.
Well, yeah, there is that. And
I'll kick you in the butt.
I'll also tell you that one of the lessons I took from that is there are occasions in which I'm absolutely bound to take advice from my adult sons. I mean, those guys are amazing people.
Yeah.
And they're both smarter than I am. There's no doubt in my mind about that. So yeah. And you know what? I think that brings us to the point at which we have to say, in all of this stuff that we're discussing and, never saying no and never being daunted, there's always necessary room for humility.
Yeah.
You have to be humble about it. And, I'll give my dad credit for this. He demonstrated humility to me in that situation. And, as he got older and his life progressed, our relationship just became better and better and better. And he finally came to understand. And, one of my favorite photographs is of him, my brother-in-law's son, so obviously my father's grandson, and his great-grandson at a Washington Nationals baseball game. And my father is wearing an O'Brien Communications Group polo shirt. And I just, honest to God, I feel so good about that, because I think that was his way of telling me that he got it.
Yeah.
Finally got it. Love that picture.
Awesome. Anything to share that we haven't touched on?
No, but I mean, obviously we've discussed this before. You and I could talk all day. I certainly want to thank you for inviting me to be on your show with you, but I also want to thank you for sharing your stories. That's always very, very meaningful to me. And if I haven't shared this with you, I'll share another piece with you called "Everybody's Got a Story." And I'll just share this brief synopsis of it. My former father-in-law, God bless this man. I will abbreviate. He had a parking lot in downtown Hartford for more than 30 years. And when I was married to his daughter, who's also the mother of my two sons, and I was also a stay-at-home dad and a full-time college student. So obviously I didn't have time to work. So he said to me, and this is one of the reasons I loved him. He always, right until the end, called me kid. Mm-hmm. So he said to me one day, "Hey kid, you want to pick up a few bucks?" So I said, "Sure, what do you want me to do?" He says, "Come down to the parking lot." He said, "Friday nights, Saturday nights, I can go home. You can take care of the lot, pick up a few bucks." So I said, "Okay." So there was a woman who, she was kind of like a street person. Her name was Peggy. She was always hanging around down there. Well, one night, my father-in-law's name was Ed, smoked a cigar. He was walking up Asylum Street, headed west. And this woman, Peggy, was headed down Asylum Street, walking east. And as they went by each other, I saw his hand just kind of brush hers. And she walked by me and said hello. And Ed walked up to the corner and he turned around. And he realized that I had seen what happened. And all he said to me was, "Everybody's got a story, kid. Everybody's got an effing story." That's all he said. So late the next afternoon, which was Saturday, I went up to the parking lot to relieve my former brother-in-law. His name was Pat. And I said, "Pat, check this out. And if it's none of my business, just tell me." And I told him the story I just told you. And he said, "Oh, yeah." He said, he was probably slipping her a 20 or a 50. He's been helping her out for years. He would never tell me that. Never. That's the kind of guy he was. But I never forgot. Everybody's got a story, kid.
Yeah.
And if people are willing to share theirs with me, I'm always grateful and always humbled by that. So I thank you, my friend.
Back at you. Thank you. I appreciate you being here.
My pleasure. I'll be happy to do it again anytime if I don't wear out my welcome.
Okay. I will take you up on that. Mark, thanks so much.
Right.
I will include a link to your story in both my notes, and I'm sure I can edit it into this video. So we'll get that figured out. And yeah, everyone check out this story. I think it's got a huge message. I know even with me being a true believer, I still benefit from hearing that. So thank you for the marvelous story, and keep up the great work, Mark.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vanoski. Watch for new episodes dropping on the first and third Tuesdays of every month.